what avoidants feel but never show during no contact. You know what's fascinating about no contact? We often think it's a clean break. Someone pulls away and that's it. Silence, coldness, indifference. But when you're dealing with an avoidant, what you see isn't always what's real. And today, I want to talk about the emotions they feel but never show during no contact. Because understanding this could change how you heal, how you interpret the silence, and how you choose your next move. Let's get one thing straight. Avoidants aren't emotionless. They're not villains. They're not sitting around celebrating the space. But they are wired differently. And that wiring doesn't lend itself to vulnerability, especially not during something as charged as no contact. When an avoidant enters no contact, the first emotion they often experience is relief. This might seem cold or even cruel to someone on the receiving end, but it's not about detachment from the person. They're detaching from the emotional intensity of the connection. For avoidants, intimacy can feel suffocating when it reaches a certain depth. The closeness triggers a fear of losing autonomy or being emotionally overwhelmed. So when space is finally created, whether they initiated the no contact or you did, it can feel like a moment to breathe. That initial relief isn't about not caring. It's about escaping the pressure they didn't know how to manage. But here's the catch. That relief doesn't last. Once the emotional dust settles, regret quietly enters the picture. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, and they won't tell anyone about it, but it's there. They begin to reflect on what was good, what they miss, and whether they acted too quickly or distanced themselves too much. It often shows up in the form of subtle internal questions. Was I too harsh? Why do I still think about them? Did I just push away someone who really cared about me? This is the internal contradiction that defines many avoidants. They want love, but they fear what it demands. They want connection, but connection feels risky. And when no contact creates that silence, their nervous system feels temporarily safe. But emotionally, they're not at peace. The part of them that craves closeness starts to miss your presence. They think about the way you made them feel. They remember the moments that made them feel seen, and all the feelings they buried start to rise, but they have no clear plan for what to do with them. They're also unlikely to admit to this regret, even to themselves at first. Avoidants tend to intellectualize their emotions rather than feel them directly. They justify the distance, they tell themselves they're better off. But that's a surface level narrative. Underneath it is discomfort, an itch they can't quite scratch. That's why some avoidants reappear weeks or months later as if nothing happened. They've sat in that cocktail of relief and regret long enough to feel pulled back in, even if they still can't articulate why. The important thing to understand is that just because they appear calm, silent, or even indifferent, it doesn't mean they aren't feeling anything. They're feeling a lot. But avoidance isn't just how they treat you. It's how they treat their own emotions. And regret is one of the hardest for them to face. During no contact, one of the most misleading things about an avoidant is their apparent disinterest. They can seem completely detached, like they've shut the door and never looked back. But beneath that exterior, there's often a quiet, persistent curiosity. They think about you more than they let on. They wonder how you're doing, whether you're thinking about them, if you've moved on, and who might be occupying the space they used to fill. But this curiosity is something they suppress because acting on it would mean exposing themselves emotionally. And for an avoidant, that feels dangerous. Avoidants are deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability. Reaching out, even just to check in, would risk confrontation, rejection, or a reopening of emotional wounds they worked hard to seal. So instead of sending that text or asking a mutual friend directly, they linger in the background. They might watch your Instagram stories without interacting. They might scroll through your profile late at night looking for signs of happiness, sadness, or a new relationship. But they'll never comment or like anything. It's passive curiosity. They want to know, but they don't want to be seen wanting to know. What's going on here is a form of emotional self-protection. If they admit to themselves that they're still curious, they also have to admit that they still care. And if they care, then they might feel obligated to take action or face the emotional weight of their decisions. That's a level of responsibility many avoidants find difficult to handle, especially if they believe reconnecting could lead to more emotional intensity than they're prepared to manage. This suppressed curiosity often creates a strange tension inside them. They may crave information about you while simultaneously telling themselves that they shouldn't care. They might feel a pull to reconnect, immediately followed by an impulse to retreat. It becomes a cycle of internal push and pull, where they oscillate between wanting closeness and fearing what it might lead to. You'll likely never see this turmoil to the outside world, and maybe even to close friends. They maintain the appearance of someone who's moved on. They'll talk rationally about the breakup, if at all, and downplay anything emotional. But that doesn't mean they're indifferent. It just means they've learned to hide their curiosity behind logic, control, and silence. Their emotional curiosity doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. And unless they've done significant self-work, they'll continue to suppress it rather than risk the vulnerability that comes with acting on it. When an avoidant goes into no contact, one of the emotions that surfaces more often than people realize is guilt. On the outside, they may appear calm, self-assured, even cold. But inside, there's a quieter voice that starts to whisper, "I didn't handle that well." Avoidants often leave relationships or situations abruptly, pulling away, shutting down, or giving minimal explanation. At the time, it feels like the only way they can protect themselves. But after the emotional dust settles, guilt often lingers beneath their carefully maintained surface. Avoidants rarely express guilt openly. To acknowledge guilt is to admit they may have caused pain, failed to communicate, or acted out of fear instead of clarity. And facing that would require emotional vulnerability, something they are wired to avoid. Instead, they rationalize. They tell themselves the distance was necessary, that things were never going to work, that you would have ended up hurt anyway. This mental self-justification helps them stay disconnected from the emotional consequences of their actions. But it doesn't erase the feeling entirely. That guilt isn't always dramatic or overwhelming. It's subtle. It shows up in moments of stillness, when they're alone, scrolling through old photos, or when something reminds them of a specific memory you shared. There's a pang, a twinge, a sense that maybe they left too quickly, said too little, or gave up too soon. But rather than act on that feeling, they internalize it, then bury it under distractions, independence, or even new connections. What makes this guilt so complex is that it doesn't usually lead to growth right away. Unlike someone more secure who might reach out to apologize or seek closure, avoidants often don't know how to repair emotional damage. Instead, they move into avoidance mode again, doubling down on the distance or remaining silent even when they feel remorse. This can be incredibly confusing for the person on the receiving end, who senses something unresolved but gets no confirmation of it. They also fear that if they express guilt, it could open the door to further emotional entanglement. Saying "I'm sorry" might lead to a conversation they feel unequipped to have. It might invite expectations they're not ready to meet. So they hold it in, often hoping that time will dull the discomfort. Even if they don't say it out loud, many avoidants know deep down that their way of leaving hurt someone who cared. The guilt doesn't always push them to make things right, but it lingers like an unfinished sentence, quiet, unresolved, and hidden beneath their emotional armor. During no contact, one of the lesser known but deeply felt emotions that avoidants experience is the fear of being misunderstood. On the surface, they may look like they've moved on without a second thought, but inside, there's a lingering anxiety that the other person now sees them as cold, heartless, or incapable of love. And the truth is, that bothers them more than they'll ever let on. They may not show it, and they definitely won't admit it, but avoidants often worry that their silence has erased the more tender parts of who they were in the relationship. This fear creates a quiet inner tension. On one hand, they feel a strong need to protect their emotional boundaries, which is why they stick to silence. But on the other hand, they hate the idea that you might think they never cared. It bothers them to imagine you telling your friends they just shut down or they walked away like it meant nothing. Even if they were the one who pulled back, a part of them still wants to be understood as someone who was doing their best with what they knew, even if that best came with emotional walls. Avoidants tend to struggle with emotional articulation. They often don't have the language to explain their inner experience in a way that feels safe and accurate. So rather than clarify their behavior, they retreat further into silence, hoping time will either soften your view or make the memory fade altogether. But in the meantime, they carry that fear that they've been reduced to one final action or one emotionally distant moment. And for people who rarely allow themselves to be fully seen, the idea of being misread hits harder than they show. They also worry that if they do try to explain, it might sound like weakness or emotional neediness, two things they try hard to avoid displaying. Vulnerability to an avoidant feels like a gamble with very high stakes. So instead of clearing the air, they choose the path of least exposure. They stay silent. They don't explain. They don't clarify. But internally, the fear lingers. What if they think I never love them? What if they think I never felt anything at all? This internal conflict doesn't always lead to action. Most of the time, it simply reinforces their avoidant pattern. Even when they want to correct the narrative or reach out to show they did care, the fear of vulnerability outweighs the fear of being misunderstood. So they live with the discomfort, hoping that somehow you'll just know what they never said. One of the most powerful and conflicting emotions avoidants experience during no contact is the desire to reconnect, paired with an equally strong fear of doing so. It's a complicated inner war. They often imagine what it would be like to talk again, to hear your voice, to feel the familiarity of the bond you once shared. They think about what they would say if they reached out, or what they would do if you message them. The desire is real, the longing is there, but instead of acting on it, they suppress it, choosing control and safety over emotional risk. This desire doesn't disappear just because they've gone silent. In fact, it often intensifies in silence. They miss certain things, not just the obvious comforts like affection or companionship, but the way you made them feel seen, known, even cared for in ways that terrified them. And that's exactly why the desire feels dangerous. Getting close again could mean having to be emotionally available, to answer questions, to show up in a way they've been avoiding. That level of intimacy feels like too much, too fast, too unpredictable. Avoidants often live in a space where they want connection, but only if they can control the terms. They want to be loved, but not overwhelmed. They want to feel secure, but without giving up independence. So when they think about reconnecting, they tend to imagine doing it in a way that won't cost them anything emotionally. Maybe they fantasize that you'll reach out first, or that you'll understand their silence and welcome them back without questions. This fantasy gives them comfort, but it also keeps them stuck because they're hoping for something that requires zero vulnerability on their part. They also fear what reconnection might trigger. What if it brings back the emotional intensity that caused them to withdraw in the first place? What if it creates expectations they're not ready to meet? That fear causes paralysis. So instead of reaching out, they wait. They fantasize, but they don't act. They feel, but they don't express. This inner tug of war leads to emotional inaction. The desire to reconnect is strong, but the instinct for self-protection is stronger. That's why avoidants can appear so indifferent. They're not emotionless. They're conflicted. They're stuck between the part of them that wants closeness and the part of them that fears it. And rather than resolve that conflict, they let silence speak for them, hoping time or distance will do the emotional work they aren't ready to face themselves. So if you've been sitting in silence, wondering what the other person feels, wondering if they even do feel anything, remember this: silence isn't always a sign of indifference. Especially with avoidance, silence is often a defense, not a declaration. They feel more than they show, but the gap between what they feel and what they do is where the pain often lives for both of you. Understanding that can bring clarity, but it doesn't mean you wait around for change. It means you recognize that their emotional patterns are not a reflection of your worth. You can't teach someone to meet you emotionally by shrinking yourself, and you don't heal by decoding silence. You heal by choosing connection with someone who doesn't make you guess how they feel. Let them wrestle with their feelings if they need to, but you move forward with dignity, with strength, and with the knowledge that real love never hides behind fear. It stands up, it shows up, and it doesn't need distance to feel safe. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for honoring your own emotional growth. If this message brought clarity or helped you feel seen in any way, then it's already served its purpose. Take care of your heart, and until next time, thank you and goodbye.